The rain was a monster that night, crashing down on Lagos like the sky itself had split open, drowning the streets in silver sheets. And it was in the middle of this storm that billionaire Jonathan Unuka's convoy slowed to a crawl, his driver muttering about poor visibility, while the rest of the world was hurrying home to shelter. But Jonathan, with weary eyes staring out of his tinted window, caught a glimpse of something that made his chest tighten. A fragile silhouette of a woman standing in the blinding downpour, with two little boys clinging to her sides, shivering, their tiny bodies wrapped in cheap sweaters that could not fight the storm. She was young, no more than mid-20s, her uniform soaked through, the faded name tag of a roadside diner still pinned to her breast pocket, her hair plastered to her face, yet she kept her head bowed against the wind as she begged the guard at the diner's entrance for mercy, for just a little shelter until the rain eased. But the guard shook his head, casting nervous glances at the manager inside, who folded his arms, lips curling with disgust, signaling a hard no, and the poor woman, whom the world would later learn was called Amaka, did the only thing a mother could do. She spread her arms like a shield and pulled her sons, Taye and Kehinde, close against her body, letting the storm batter her while her children trembled against the only roof they had left, the roof of her will. Jonathan's heart jolted in that instant, and though his aides urged him to ignore it, "Sir, we must keep moving. The weather is dangerous." He tapped the glass and said one word that froze them all. "Stop." The convoy screeched to a halt, wipers thrashing, raindrops hissing on the hot engine. And before anyone could object, Jonathan stepped out into the storm without an umbrella, his tailored suit darkening instantly, his shoes filling with water, his face unreadable, yet pulled by something older than logic, something deeper than wealth. The woman flinched when she saw him approach, flanked by guards, fear flashing in her eyes, as she cried quickly, "Please, sir, I'm not causing trouble. I only need a ride to the clinic. My boys have fever. They're burning up, and I couldn't afford the bus fare tonight." Jonathan's gaze swept down to the children, thin faces, eyes too tired for their age, lips pale from cold, and something inside him cracked, not with pity, but with recognition of a pain he thought had been buried with his late wife and daughter. He gestured firmly to his aide. "Blankets, now, get them into the car." The diner manager barged out, shouting above the storm, "Sir, don't bother with her. She was fired for insubordination. She's trouble." But Jonathan turned to him, eyes steel behind raindrops, and said, "Then you won't miss her standing here." And without another word, he wrapped his coat around Amaka's shoulders, ushered her and the twins into the warm SUV, and as she climbed in, something slipped from her collar, clinking softly against the leather seat, a small locket, scratched, faded, barely holding together, yet when it flipped open, it revealed a photograph inside, water-streaked, but still alive, of a young woman smiling at the sunrise, a face Jonathan knew too well, a face he had buried in his soul, his lost daughter, Zara. In that instant, time folded in on itself. The storm outside became a whisper, the chaos of the city blurred, and Jonathan's hand froze mid-air as he stared at the locket trembling in Amaka's grasp, while across from him the boys coughed weakly, unaware that their existence had just reopened a chapter that fate had hidden for 10 long years. And Jonathan, the man who had once been pulled back from the jaws of death by the song of a miracle child, now found himself staring at 2 children and a waitress who might carry the very blood he thought the grave had stolen forever. And as the convoy pulled back into the rain, the billionaire's eyes no longer saw just a soaked stranger and her twins, but a mystery born of love, loss, and a truth waiting to shatter everything he believed about the past.
By the time the convoy reached Mercy Heights Clinic, the storm had not softened but raged harder, like it knew secrets were being dragged into the light. And as nurses rushed Tay and Kehinde into a small triage bay, Jonathan lingered in the corridor, his mind replaying the image of the locket, his pulse hammering louder than the rain, because that face, the woman smiling from the old photograph, was not just familiar, it was unforgettable. It was Zara, his daughter, who had died 10 years ago in the fiery crash that had nearly ended his own will to live. The same tragedy that had left him hollow until a barefoot girl's song stitched his spirit back together. And yet here was evidence suggesting Zara might have lived long enough to give him grandsons he never knew existed. Amaka, the waitress who had shielded the twins in the storm, sat quietly in the corner of the ward, clutching her gown as though ready for someone to chase her away. But when Jonathan asked, "That locket, where did you get it?" her voice trembled with honesty. She told him about the morning 9 years ago when she found a small box by the gates of St. Anthony's Church in Ajagunle, wrapped in cloth and plastic, breathing with the faint cries of newborn twins. And tucked beside them was the locket and a note scrawled in a shaky hand. "They are innocent. Please save them." Amaka admitted she had no reason to believe the note except for the look in the baby's eyes. And instead of leaving them to a system that might tear them apart, she carried them home and raised them as best as she could, working double shifts at the diner, skipping meals so they could eat, selling her few belongings to pay for books. And though she was never their blood mother, she gave them the only thing no one else dared offer: love without condition. Jonathan listened, his throat tight, while his lawyer, Mr. Okoye, arrived to hear the story and to collect the fragile evidence: the locket, the faded note, the bracelet fragments hidden behind the photo, all pointing to Zara. But the question haunted them both. If Zara had indeed survived the crash, why had she left the children at a church gate? And who was the shadow mentioned in the nurse's rumors of a powerful man connected to the maternity home records? Meanwhile, as the twins slept under the glow of heat lamps, Jonathan stood over them with eyes wet from memories, recalling Zara's stubborn smile, her voice that always carried laughter even in arguments. And he whispered softly to himself, "Could it be?" The weight of the years pressed down on his shoulders, yet beneath it sparked a dangerous flicker of hope. And while outside the clinic cameras began to gather, rumors already spreading that the billionaire had been seen carrying a poor waitress and 2 children into a hospital during the storm, inside Jonathan's soul a deeper storm brewed, one made not of thunder and water, but of grief, mystery, and the terrifying possibility that fate had returned what tragedy had once stolen, though in a form that could tear his world apart or bind it forever. The storm gave way to a humid dawn, and in that uneasy quiet, Mercy Heights Clinic became the stage where hidden truths began to stir. For while the twins recovered under watchful nurses, Jonathan and Okoye worked through the night, tracing the fragments of evidence inside the old locket. And what they discovered shook the foundations of Jonathan's past. A faded discharge slip from a shuttered maternity home, a hospital bracelet with the name Zara Yu, and signatures that hinted at hands far darker than coincidence, one of them unmistakably belonging to Benedict Naduka, Jonathan's estranged cousin who had once nearly stolen his fortune with a forged will. And though Benedict was supposed to have been silenced by prison walls years earlier, it now seemed his shadow had lingered in places Jonathan never imagined. Still, amid the fear, there was a glimmer that felt like salvation, for the DNA tests rushed by Okoye confirmed beyond doubt that Taye and Kehinde shared Jonathan's blood. And with trembling hands the billionaire touched their sleeping brows as though blessing them, whispering promises into the silence, while Amaka, sitting quietly by the window, tried to absorb the enormity of what she had stumbled into, never asking for reward, never demanding recognition, only insisting I kept them safe as best I could. Her humility striking Jonathan deeper than any wealth he had ever counted. And so he made a decision. He ordered the best pediatric team to oversee the twins' recovery. He directed Okoye to draft guardianship papers recognizing Amaka as their legal mother. And he announced privately to the hospital director, "These boys are mine, but so is she, for without her they would not be alive." And though it seemed like a blessing, the reunion of a broken lineage, the healing of a wound 10 years deep, it planted a new seed of danger, because outside those clinic walls, word had already escaped that Jonathan Unuka, the billionaire once resurrected by a miracle child, had now found twin heirs linked to the daughter everyone believed was dead, and whispers traveled fast through Lagos, winding their way into offices, into slums, and eventually into the ears of men who saw not children, but fortune. Benedict, sipping palm wine in a dusty compound, grinned when the news reached him. For though prison had stolen years, it had not stolen ambition. And if Zara's bloodline had returned in the form of 2 frail boys under the roof of a billionaire, then perhaps fate had handed him a second chance, not at redemption, but at revenge. And while Jonathan stood in the clinic hallway feeling the fragile bloom of hope, he did not yet know that outside, wheels of greed and malice had begun to turn, ensuring that the family he longed to reclaim would soon be tested in ways no storm could ever match.
The warmth of Jonathan's discovery lasted barely 2 days before the shadow of disaster clawed its way into the fragile peace. For while Amaka stayed by the twins' bedside, feeding them spoons of hot pop, and Jonathan quietly sketched plans to move them into the Banana Island mansion where safety could be guaranteed, the outside world was already circling like vultures around a carcass, and it began with an unexpected visitor at the clinic, Aunt Monica, the same woman who once spat venom at Olivia and branded her a witch, now appearing in cheap perfume and bright colors, insisting with a shrill voice that she was the only living relative of Amaka and therefore the rightful guardian of the children. The nurses frowned, security stiffened, and Jonathan, remembering Olivia's trembling fear years earlier when that voice sliced through a hospital door, stepped in firmly, his presence towering. But Monica was not the only storm that day. For hours later, a lawyer in a charcoal suit arrived carrying documents that reeked of Benedict's schemes, claiming that under the revised inheritance trust, all minor heirs of Zara were to be placed under Benedict's stewardship until adulthood, a cruel echo of the forged will that once nearly stripped Jonathan of everything. And though Okoye shredded the argument with calm precision, exposing the papers as laughably weak, the very existence of such filings stirred chaos in the press. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's secret grandsons? Custody battle looms." And paparazzi camped outside Mercy Heights like wolves hungry for blood. Amaka wept quietly, begging Jonathan to let her and the boys slip away unnoticed. "I can live anywhere, sir, just not here where the world wants to tear us apart." But Jonathan, voice heavy with conviction, said, "You saved them, and you saved me. You will not run again." Yet even as he vowed protection, disaster was already creeping closer. For one of the clinic nurses, bribed by unseen hands, smuggled out confidential files and photographs of the twins, leaking them to a tabloid that spread the story across the nation in a single night. And when dawn broke, the compound where Amaka Was lived was swarmed with curious neighbors and cruel whispers, some calling her blessed, others branding her a fraud who had trapped a billionaire. And in a dusty room far across the city, Benedict slammed a fist on the table, eyes gleaming with triumph. Now the world knows they exist, and when the world watches, fear grows faster than love. And his voice, low and sharp, promised the next strike would not come through courts or papers, but through venom and betrayal, the kind of curse that tears families apart from the inside. And as Jonathan kissed his grandson's brows that night, he did not know that already within the clinic walls, someone had slipped poison into a food tray meant for Amaka, and attempted poisoning, the same way Olivia had once been targeted, proving that history's curse was not finished, it was only sharpening its claws.
The attempted poisoning rattled the clinic like an earthquake, but it was only the opening crack before the ground fully split. For 2 nights later, just as Jonathan prepared discharge papers to move Amaka and the twins into his heavily guarded mansion, the worst blow struck during a board meeting where Jonathan collapsed suddenly, his face drained, his breath shallow, and the hospital rushed him into ICU under flashing cameras, the news erupting instantly. Billionaire back in coma, heirs under threat. As the city buzzed, Benedict made his move, swaggering into the mansion with a forged emergency directive, claiming Jonathan had signed over authority to him weeks earlier in case of incapacitation. And though Okoye challenged the validity, Benedict's men, lawyers, clerks, even a judge in his pocket, began filing motions that effectively placed every asset, including responsibility for the twins, under his greasy shadow, turning Amaka overnight from a mother who had protected her boys for 9 years into a powerless tenant trapped in a mansion run by a man who despised her. And though she tried to remain calm for Taye and Kahende, she wept silently when the portraits of Zara and Jonathan were removed from the hallway, replaced with Benedict's sneering photographs, his voice echoing through the corridors. "This house was always mine, and no beggar girl or market waitress will change that." But what he did not count on was the fire that had been quietly building in Olivia, the miracle child grown into a woman, who arrived at the mansion carrying not only her guitar, but also a small device, a recording she had obtained after overhearing Benedict plotting Jonathan's permanent demise over the phone. That evening, in front of the staff and the twins, Amaka stood trembling as Olivia pressed play, and Benedict's voice slithered from the speakers. "When he dies, everything is mine. I don't care what it takes. The girl, I'll send her back to the gutter. Jonathan must not wake up." The room froze, servants gasping, guards shifting uneasily, and for the first time the twins looked at the man who had terrorized their new home and saw not a guardian, but a monster. Benedict lunged for the device, but police officers, summoned secretly by Okoye, stepped from the shadows and clamped cuffs around his wrists, reading charges of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted murder, while Benedict screamed curses that bounced off the marble walls, dragged out like a thief exposed at last. Yet even as justice seemed to claim victory, the climax demanded one final test. Because in the ICU, Jonathan's heart faltered again, monitors screaming, and Amaka, clutching her boys, whispered in fear, "If he doesn't wake, they will say the blessing came too late." And Olivia, tears brimming, placed her guitar beside the bed, took Jonathan's hand and began to sing, her voice trembling but rising like a prayer, joined by Amaka, who for the first time let her own cracked voice break free. And in that fragile duet, hope and desperation collided, carrying the weight of Zara's memory, the love of 2 mothers, and the laughter of 2 boys who needed a future. The truth was now revealed. Jonathan had heirs. Benedict was finished. But the final test lingered in the silence. Would Jonathan open his eyes and choose life again, or would this victory come at the cost of the man whose heart tied them all together? The ICU was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of machines, a battlefield where life and death tugged at Jonathan's soul. For hours the doctors whispered grim forecasts, shaking their heads,
But inside the sterile silence, Olivia and Amaka refused to leave, their voices weaving fragile threads of hope as they sang in turns, soft hymns and lullabies, melodies that carried memories of rainstorms, market nights, and promises whispered to children under bridges. Until sometime near dawn, when even the nurses had begun to believe nothing more could be done, Jonathan's fingers twitched just as they had 10 years earlier. His eyelids fluttered, and a weak rasp carried through the room, "Olivia," followed by a second whisper, "Zara's boys." And as Amaka collapsed to her knees in relief, the monitors spiked, proving life had not surrendered after all. Within hours, Jonathan stabilized, and news spread across Nigeria like wildfire. Billionaire wakes again by miracle song. Cousin arrested for conspiracy. Secret heirs confirmed. The headlines called Olivia the angel, Amaka the saint, and Jonathan the man who refused to die. But behind the headlines lay the true resolution. Benedict, shackled by the law, faced 18 years in prison, his schemes finally silenced. Aunt Monica, exposed by court testimony as having abandoned Olivia years earlier, vanished into the shadows of disgrace. Amaka, once a waitress begging for shifts, stood publicly recognized as the legal guardian and mother of the twins she had chosen when no one else would. And Jonathan, tears running freely as he signed the adoption papers, declared to cameras and to God, "These boys are my blood, but she is their mother, and together we are a family forged by storms." Words that drew applause from nurses and staff who had watched love outfight greed. That same week, the mansion that once echoed with Benedict's cruel orders transformed again, its halls filled with children's laughter, its walls hung with new portraits, Zara smiling beside her sons, Olivia strumming her guitar, Amaka holding the twins while Jonathan stood behind them with pride instead of loneliness. And though scars of betrayal lingered like faint shadows, the curse had broken, replaced by redemption. And in the quiet of his room, Jonathan whispered prayers of gratitude for the second life given not once but twice, vowing never to squander it again. For Amaka, the resolution was simpler. Each night she tucked her boys into clean sheets, listening to their giggles fade into sleep, and reminded herself of the rainstorm that had nearly washed them away, but instead delivered them into destiny. For Olivia, the miracle child grown into a woman, the resolution was a call to expansion. Sing to Heal opened a new wing dedicated to children who had been abandoned or called cursed, proving that sometimes the voices the world tried to silence could be the very voices that saved it. And as cameras rolled for Jonathan's first public appearance after recovery, his voice carried not as a billionaire, but as a father, a grandfather, and a man who had learned the hardest way that blood builds families, but love keeps them alive. And he ended with words that echoed like scripture across the crowd. "We thought the rain came to drown us, but it came to wash us clean. And what remains is stronger than death, richer than gold, and louder than any storm. Family."
The world had seen many stories of wealth and betrayal, but none gripped the people like the tale of the waitress in the storm, the twins who were almost lost, and the billionaire who refused to let death silence his legacy. And as weeks turned into months, the mansion became a living folktale in itself, a place where drivers slowed down outside just to glimpse the gate, whispering, "That's where the miracle family lives." While in stools, children repeated the story of Amaka's courage as though it were a fable, and church choirs borrowed lines from Olivia's healing songs, weaving them into hymns that made entire congregations weep. Inside, the family grew into a rhythm of simple joys, Jonathan teaching Taye chess and Kehinde piano,
Amaka walking through the garden at dusk with a peace she never thought she'd earn. Olivia balancing her days between flight lessons, the Sing to Heal Center, and late-night lullabies for her little brothers. And though reporters still hovered, hoping for scandal, what they found was laughter at breakfast, school bags by the door, and the unshakable bond of people who had survived betrayal together, proof that storms do not only destroy, they also plant seeds. But as much as the family settled into love, the story rippled outward, touching strangers who sat in their living rooms and asked themselves hard questions. Would I have taken those babies in if I'd found them? Would I have stopped in the rain like Jonathan did? Would I have believed in miracles or walked away? And those questions became the heartbeat of the legend, stirring comments online and long debates at market stalls, because everyone who heard the tale found a piece of themselves in it, either the faithless guard who turned Amaka away, the greedy cousin who chased shadows, the fearful aunt who used her tongue as a knife, or the child who sang until death itself bent down in surrender. In the end, as Jonathan told the nation during his final press conference, "This story isn't just about me or about them. It's about us all. How we treat the weak when no one is watching, how we face betrayal, and how we choose whether to drown in the rain or walk through it together." And with those words he left the podium, letting Amaka take his place, her voice quiet but strong as she looked into the cameras and said, "I was a poor waitress, but I found a treasure greater than gold in two tiny faces. And if you believe love still conquers greed, then share this story. Tell it to your children, because one day they will face their own storm." And in that moment, the story closed not as a fairy tale, but as a mirror, a reminder that the rain comes for everyone, but only some choose to stop and save.
10 years after the storm that first bound them together, the Unuka mansion no longer felt like a fortress scarred by betrayal, but like a lighthouse standing firm against the sea. Its halls filled with voices of children growing into men, its gardens alive with music and stories, and its gates forever open to those who needed hope. Taye, tall and sharp-eyed, dreamed of becoming an engineer, sketching bridges and towers on every scrap of paper he could find, while Kehinde, softer but equally brilliant, painted skies in wild colors that now adorned the walls of Sing to Heal, his art auctioned to fund programs for children who had no homes. And Amaka, once the weary waitress whose shift ended in rain, now directed community kitchens across Lagos, feeding hundreds in the same streets where she once went hungry, her quiet resilience earning her the title Mother of Mercy, whispered by neighbors and strangers alike. While Olivia, the barefoot singer turned pilot, traveled the world with her voice, opening healing centers in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, her name a beacon, reminding people that miracles were not accidents, but choices wrapped in courage. And Jonathan, though age bent his shoulders and slowed his stride, never stopped smiling, for he had lived to see redemption with his own eyes, to watch the family he thought he had buried bloom into something larger than his fortune could have ever bought. And when asked by journalists what his greatest achievement was, he never spoke of his companies or his billions, or even his awards, but always of one thing: the day I stopped in the rain, because that choice had rewritten his destiny. And in that way, the moral of the story became plain. Storms will come, betrayal will strike, greed will test, but love that chooses to stop, to act, to believe, will outlive every curse. So the legend spread, not only as gossip or news, but as a parable, and at the end of each retelling came the question that still lingers today. If it were you driving past in the rain, would you stop? A question left not for Jonathan nor Amaka,
nor Olivia, but for every heart that beats and every hand that holds a steering wheel. And as the storyteller's voice fades, the closing call rises with a soft echo. If you believe love conquers storms, subscribe, share this story, and let the world know that miracles are real.